Namaste mera dosto, Elizabeth Thakur here. Hope all is well. Today we are going to watch a very interesting video that deals with historical facts on Hindu genocide and other attacks. It is explaining the same cycle we continue to see with Hindus in that history continues to repeat itself. So I have an announcement to make before we get started. For the people that are so-called secular, this video is not for you. If you are on this video now, please stop watching it. This video is not for people that are scared of the truth. I really don't care about views. I care about awareness only. I know some of you will mistake or maybe even gaslight me and say this is hate, but one should not confuse hate with simple awareness. I do not know how many times I have to say this, but I am for the survival of humanity itself, not for any particular religion. No. This is about humanity. So I want to make myself clear from the beginning. Just a disclaimer. So let's watch the video now.
After the first Battle of Independence, the Ottoman Sultan from Turkey wrote a letter, and that was forwarded by the British to the Indian Muslims, saying that the Ottoman Empire condemned the Indian Muslim support to the First War of Independence and that they should be loyal to the British. The British are allies. That right from 1840, 1841, the Mopla Muslims were committing grievous atrocities and grievous outrages against Hindus in Malabar. Towards the end of World War I, by 1918, the seeds of Khilafat had been sowed. The grievance of the Indian Muslim was attached to the Turkish Caliphate, not to India. The Delhi anti-Hindu riots. It was planned right from the 5th of December. The first murder was of a constable called Ratan Lal, who was a kafir working for a kafir state. And we were told by the entire global media that it was an anti-Muslim pogrom.
Sangam.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So the subject is Khilafat 2.0, and I'll start with a few quotes. Do you think we only have the history of Hudaybiyah? If you forget, we will remind you about Badr, Uhud, and Karbala. Do you think we only know how to talk about Swabar? Then you are mistaken. You should learn about our Jihad. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. This was said by Barkhadat Shiro, Ladida Sakloon, on 11th of December 2019, the day the violence broke out in Delhi. We dream of a 2047 where the political power has returned to the Muslim community from whom it was unjustly taken away by the British. PFI cadres and Muslim youths should repeatedly be told that they were working for Deen. Allah had created the Kainat and Muslims were made for two reasons. The first, to establish the law of Allah, and the second, Muslims are Dai on earth. This should always be kept in mind. Along with this, PFI spoke about turning India into an Islamic nation, replacing the constitution with the Sharia, arming Muslims so that they can kill coward Hindus. During the FIFA World Cup, Muslim journalist, not my words, her words, Muslim journalist Rana Ayub extended unbridled support to Morocco. She said that she was standing in solidarity with Morocco and Palestine. She also sent a lot of love to Morocco. Now, do we think Rana Ayub is a great football fan? Because I tried to check. There were hardly any tweets or hardly any posts about football. So why did she extend that support to Morocco? Morocco is a Muslim nation. Rana Ayub's support to Morocco, PFI's plans, and Ladida Sakloon's Facebook post points towards the Muslim Indian population's commitment to the Ummah. The Ummah is the global Muslim brotherhood. And to understand why the Indian Muslim has this unbridled support towards the Ummah, far more than their own nations and far more than their own Hindu brethren, so-called, we have to travel a little back in time to Kerala. It was the loyalty towards the Khilafat started much before we know. It didn't start with the Khilafat movement in the 1920s. I would have you know that it was first invoked by the British when Lord Wellesley forwarded a letter from the Ottoman Empire to the tyrant Tipu Sultan. It was said that Tipu Sultan should mend his relationship with the British Empire because the British were allies. This was a letter written by the Ottoman Sultan. It was next invoked in 1857, right after the First Battle of Independence. After the First Battle of Independence, the Ottoman Sultan from Turkey wrote a letter, and that was forwarded by the British to the Indian Muslims, saying that the Ottoman Empire condemned the Indian Muslim support to the First War of Independence and that they should be loyal to the British. The British are allies. After that, of course, you saw the Indian Muslim commitment towards the freedom struggle dwindle vastly. So the sentiment of Ummah within the Indian Muslim population started from the mid 1800s. It was not about the Khilafat at that time. It was not about Mecca. It was not about any of that. It was from the Ottoman Empire directly to the Indian Muslims. Interestingly, while the British were using the Ottoman Empire to buy the loyalty of the Indian Muslim, the Mopla Muslim had already started committing atrocities against Hindus in Malabar. I bought two books where government communication of that time in Malabar was documented. One of the first communication was from 1846. In 1846, a Mopla Muslim chopped up a Nayar Hindu youth and he went and hid in a mosque. When he was hiding in the mosque, the British, of course, came and they were trying to get him out to surrender. He said that he will die fighting the infidels, and he was, of course, gunned down. In that communication, it was clearly mentioned that right from 1840, 1841, the Mopla Muslims were committing grievous atrocities and grievous outrages against Hindus in Malabar. Now, of course, if the government communication says that grievous outrages were being committed by Mopla Muslims right from 1841, I think we can safely assume that right from 1830s, they were committing these atrocities against Hindus. Towards the end of World War I, by 1918, the seeds of Khilafat had been sowed because the Ottoman Empire was breaking up. The first meeting in India regarding the Khilafat movement was held on February 9, 1990. It was the first Khilafat Day was then observed on October 17, 1919. In Delhi, there was a Khilafat conference which was held. In this conference, a resolution was adopted saying that the Indian Muslim is going to refrain from joining the celebrations of World War I and are going to boycott it, boycott British goods, boycott everything British in the demand that the Ottoman Empire and the Sultan be restored. The Congress leaders at that time had extended full support to the Khilafat movement. On 24th November, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi went on to proclaim that he would go on a non-cooperation movement because the Hindus were in support of the Indian Muslims in their quest for Khilafat, in their quest for the Caliphate, the Turkish Caliphate. He called it a just cause. The Congress was, of course, of the hope that the British would give us our independence if we participated in World War I, in which Indians took part in hordes. Of course, that did not happen. Soon, the Rowlatt Act was established by the British, and there were widespread atrocities against Indians. In one such protest against the Rowlatt Act, as we all know, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened. Now, it is interesting how to Nehru and Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, Jallianwala Bagh massacre was sort of clubbed together with the demand for the Turkish Caliphate. In Amritsar, in December 1990, there was a congressional meeting that was held, an annual session. In that, Mr. Motilal Nehru, in his presidential address on 27 December, categorically stated that the demand was for justice in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and, of course, to concede to the Muslim demand of the caliphate in Turkey. He said, "It is impossible for one part of the nation to stand aloof while the other part is suffering a serious grievance. The grievance of the Indian Muslim was attached to the Turkish Caliphate, not to India. They weren't even protesting
they're
against
not
the
very
royal
patriotic, are they?
They were just bothered about the caliphate. In the Nagpur session in December 1920, the Congress gave the British a deadline of 1 year, not only to deliver justice in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre case, but also to establish the caliphate in Turkey. At the annual session in 1920 in Nagpur, the Khilafat leaders read Quranic verses. They called for jihad against infidels. When this was condemned and Mohandas Gandhi was questioned, he said, "Oh, they're talking about the British bureaucracy, not about
sure.
Hindus, only the
Yeah,
British
right.
bureaucracy because they're the only infidels according to him." While Gandhi and Nehru extended their support to the Khilafat movement, the Mopla Muslims were already going on rampages against Malabar Hindus. This is 100 years in 1800s, 100 years before finally a genocide of the Malabar Hindus took place. So far, the outrages against Malabar Hindus were considered low-level violence. I'm of course not saying that the outrages were not severe, but they were not coordinated mass action like a genocide. I'll give you an example.
hidden genocide.
In 1894, for example, there were several Muslims who went on a rampage in Malabar, started desecrating temples and all of that. They then took shelter in a temple, and when they were asked to come out, they of course came out in a hail of fire and died. In the book by Deputy Collector of Calicut, Mr. Gopalan Nair, he writes that there was no trigger for this sort of violence that could be recognized. It was just a result of unbridled Mohammedan fanaticism. On the 25th of February 1896, a gang of 20 Mopla Muslims went on a killing spree. They terrorized the village. The book says that during this period, Hindus were murdered and their hair was cut off. They were forcefully converted to Islam as well. In February 1919, for example, a gang of Mopla Muslims, headed by a dismissed Mopla head constable, began to brew trouble. Following their usual methods, they broke in and defiled several temples. They killed almost every Brahmin and Nair that they could find in their path. They died in a hail of fire, of course. After hundreds and thousands of such incidents of low-level violence for over 100 years, right from the mid-1800s, finally, in 1921, there was a mass genocide of Hindus in Malabar by the Mopla Muslims. In August 1921, it is estimated by official numbers that over 10,000 Malabar Hindus were murdered. This is an official estimate, so we can obviously assume that the real number was much higher. The Khilafat movement had built up to the Malabar genocide of Hindus. There were women who were raped by the Muslims. There were Hindus
but they're
who were
all
beheaded.
for feminine,
there were families
divinity,
that were
aren't they?
annihilated and even burnt alive. There's one such incident in which a pregnant Hindu woman was murdered and her fetus was pulled out of her body. She lay bleeding on the road. I'll narrate one more incident, one more massacre during the Malabar genocide of Hindus.
Oh yeah, but they're all for women power.
On the 25th of September 1921, a Khilafat leader held a rally of about 4,000 Mopla Muslims. In that, there were calls to jihad that were made, Quranic verses that were read, and then 40 Hindus were caught hold of. 38 were murdered. Only 3 of the 38 were shot. The rest were beheaded and thrown into the Thuvur well. It is said that even 3 days after the beheading, there were some of them who had life left in them. The Mopla Muslims went down the well, made sure that they beheaded them completely, and came out again. I will narrate what Mr. Nair writes in his book about this incident. Just at the brink, there is a small tree. The executioner stood here and after cutting the neck with his sword, pushed the body into the well. Many of the people who were thus thrown in were not dead, but escape was impossible. The sides of the well are cut in hard laterite rock and there are no steps. It is said that some people were crying out from the well even on the 3rd day of the massacre. They must have died a peculiarly horrible death. At the time when this massacre was perpetrated, It was a rainy season, and there is some water in the Week, but now it's dry. And any visitor can have a look at the gruesome sight. The bottom is entirely filled with human bones. Pandit Rishi Ram, the Arya Samaj missionary, who was standing by my side, counted 30 skulls. One skull deserves particular mention. It is still seen divided neatly into two halves. This is said to be the skull of an old man named Kumara Panikar, whose head was slowly cut into two halves by means of a saw. Does anybody draw a parallel? The skull cut into two with a saw? It happened in Kashmir when a woman was cut into two with a saw. The three judges who presided over a special tribunal in Calicut about the Malabar genocide said that the Moplas have been described as a barbarous and savage race, and unhappily, the description seems appropriate at the present day. This is a court ruling. This is not the figment of the right-wing imagination. He went on to say that they went on a rampage against the Hindu population of Malabar. This is a court proceeding again. Now, people like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar to Annie Besant, they have widely written about the Malabar genocide of Hindus and condemned the violence that the Muslim hordes went against the Hindus. However, our left historians want us to believe to date that the Malabar genocide of Hindus was indeed a peasant uprising. So the left historians tell us that the peasants of the time were mostly Muslims and the landlord were Hindus who were a savage, barbaric bunch. And the Muslims went on a rampage against the Hindus because the Hindu landlords were treating them unfairly.
Oh, that's a really good excuse.
Now, there is an 1852
That's such a good
report by
excuse
one
to
Mr. T.L.
cut a man in half.
He was a British commissioner who was sent to Malabar in 1852. Again, this is almost 70 years before the genocide actually took place. And Mr. T.L. Strange categorically said that the outrages by the Mopla Muslims against the Hindus were a result of Mohammedan fanaticism, that the Hindu landlords were extremely
they have some
kind
imagination,
and they were
don't
treating
they?
their Muslim peasants well, and that any of these outrages were not a result of a peasant uprising against Hindu landlords, but pure and simple jihad. Do you see a parallel? Do you remember any riot, attempted genocide recently which was packaged differently to make sure that Hindus forget their own genocide? The Delhi anti-Hindu riots. It was planned right from the 5th of December. The first murder was of a constable called Ratan Lal, who was a kafir working for a kafir state. And we were told by the entire global media that it was an anti-Muslim pogrom, when Hindus were killed amid chants of Nara-e-Takbir, Allahu Akbar, when Tahir Hussain went on record to say that their aim was to teach kafirs a lesson. Moving back to 1921. In November 1921, the Congress Working Committee appointed a committee headed by, of course, a Muslim, Faiz Tyabji, to understand the kind of outrages that were committed against Hindus in Malabar. It had to be headed by a Muslim, of course, because how can a Hindu be fair? It is only a Muslim who can fairly evaluate whether his co-religionists murdered Hindus. There were 2 Muslims in the panel and only 1 Hindu, because Hindus who are being killed don't really deserve a voice. In a few months' time, the committee was disbanded without really carrying out an investigation. At the Congress National Session held in Ahmedabad in 21, the acting president, again a Muslim,
Let's just sweep
Mr.
everything
Hakim
under the
Majmoor
rug.
Khan, expressed regret over these scandalous events. There was a resolution
And just throw Hindus under the bus all the
to
time.
condemn the violence. Guess why it didn't go through? Because one Mr. Hasrat Mohani opposed the resolution to condemn the Mopla violence. In the 36th annual session, of course, the Congress leaders distanced themselves from the violence, hardly condemned it, and blamed the British instead of the Mopla Muslims who had declared
gotta blame
jihad
somebody
against
else.
Hindus.
Can't blame
and
the
on
people that
record
actually
wanted to rid
did the
Malabar of
genocide.
the Kafirs. The Khilafat movement more or less propelled Muslim nationalism in Indian Muslims. Now, Muslim nationalism is very different
Yeah.
from Hindu nationalism, and we'll come to that in
Yeah,
the later
it's
part of this talk.
anti-patriotic.
While the Mopla outrages were happening, while the Malabar Hindus were being murdered in 1921,
Yeah, they really care about
1922,
humanity. I
in
can very tell. It's
1923,
awesome.
a book,
They're doing a great
Rangila
job.
Rasool, was published. Now, we all know that Rangila Rasool was published because it was a satirical take on the life of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad. However, very few of us know that Rangila Rasool was actually published in response to two books that was published by the Muslims insulting Hindus. It is only after that that Mahashay Rajpal decided to publish Rangila Rasool. What happened then? In 1929, Mahashay Rajpal was brutally murdered because the Muslims were upset.
Yeah, you can't upset them. You can't.
Interestingly, the murderer of Mahashay Rajpal was represented in court by none other than Muhammad Jinnah. And Muhammad Iqbal, who is now a liberal hero, sang peons of the murderer. What we also perhaps don't talk about as often is that the murder of Mahashay Rajpal led to the British passing 295A. 295A, which we now know as a more or less draconian act, which prosecutes and persecutes anybody who offends anybody else's religious feelings. Now, it came into being because a bunch of Muslims were extremely upset about a book that was published after Muslims insulted Hindus because their feelings were hurt. They murdered a man, they ran rampages, they ran riots, and the British thought, oh, if we don't appease them and if we don't assuage their easily hurt sentiments, they're going to murder again and they're going to riot again. And therefore, 295A was passed. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, of course, condemned Mahashay Rajpal. He said that just because the Muslims had insulted the Hindu sentiment, there was no reason for Mahashay Rajpal to do the same and offend the Muslims. He even justified, to a large extent, the violence, saying that the Muslims were hurt, poor things. While Mahashay Rajpal was murdered in 1929 for a book that was in response to the insult to Hindus, as I just said, in 1924, the Kohat violence took place. Now, what is the common thread between the murder of Mahashay Rajpal and the Kohat violence? During the Kohat violence, the imams from mosques had started making outrageous speeches against Hindus, calling for jihad of kafirs, of course.
They always
At
do
that
that.
time, the Hindus had decided to respond in their own coin, and therefore they, wrote
So
a couple
many
of poems that
genocides
called out the Muslims for their hate, for
and
their kafir hate.
attacks and
Now, the moment the Hindus decided
just
that, all right,
riots.
these Muslims have gone
Crazy.
on
I
and
can't
said
call
that they
it
want to commit
protest.
jihad against Hindus, so why don't we say something in return as well? The moment the Hindus decided to protect themselves and defend themselves, the Muslim hordes went on a riot again. Thousands of Hindus' homes were burnt, Hindus were murdered, so on and so forth. Again, those who were condemned were the Hindus.
Yeah, because
They were blamed for
kafirs
their
are
own
like
genocide,
slaves
their own
for
murder.
radical Muslims.
Why would you respond to the Muslims, they said. In 1946, now that we've spoken about the 1920s and the Malabar genocide, we've understood
Talk about
the contours
inequality.
of it. Let's come to 1946. The massacre of Hindu in Bengal was carefully coordinated by Jinnah. He chose the 16th day of Ramadan to coordinate the direct action day. Why the 16th day of Ramadan, you said? Because on that day, Prophet Muhammad himself fought the Battle of Badr and he defeated the Kafirs. It was said that the Muslims had fought this war and won this war with divine intervention of Allah. Now that we're talking about Battle of Badr, do you remember who else mentioned the Battle of Badr in the beginning of my speech? Ladida Sakloon, on the 11th of December 2019, when Delhi was engulfed in violence. She too said that they know how to fight the Battle of Badr, which is essentially Prophet Muhammad and Muslims fighting a decisive victory over Kafirs. On the 16th of August, of course, Calcutta...
Isn't that the only
16th of August,
religion that has
Calcutta
justified
with
their
posters
violence
lionizing
because of
Jinnah.
divine intervention.
One of the posters by the mayor said, Kafir toder dongsherar derine shorbik hatyakand ghotbe. It essentially means that the massacre is not far away and the end is not far away. You will be murdered. The aim was to make Bengal the land of the pure and to ensure that Hindus were driven out. What followed on the 16th night, I think we all know. Hindu men were beheaded, women were raped, homes
It's like a repeat
were
of
burnt.
history over and over again.
When the Muslims went on a rampage against Hindus during the Direct Action Day, there was one man, Gopal Patha, who stood up and took weapons. He decided that he will defend Hindus, because the outrages were started by the Muslims. Mr. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi again went to Mr. Gopal Patha and told him to lay down arms. Mr. Gopal Patha refused. He said he will defend his brethren. Mr. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, I'm guessing, was not very happy, but thankfully for us, Gopal Patha prevailed. What I have said so far, basically, right from mid-1800s to 1946, there are certain themes that emerge from over 100 years of Muslim outrages against Hindus. One, for over a century, Hindus kept getting massacred over and over and over again. Hindu women kept getting raped
And it's still happening,
over and over and over again. Hindu homes kept getting burnt over and over
But
and
we're just
over
supposed
again.
to act like it's not
The
happening and
Hindu
pretend
leaders
it's not.
of that time decided to look away.
Yep.
All of their outrages were packaged differently. The Khilafat movement was packaged as a freedom struggle. Oh, the Musalman just wants freedom from the British, and therefore it's Khilafat. The Khilafat word was also chosen quite intelligently, because when a normal human being, when a normal Hindu listens to the word Khilafat, he thinks that you're against something, Khilaf. You're against the British. But the Khilafat is just another word for the caliphate, which means they were fighting for the caliphate in Turkey. The outrage against Hindus and the naked display of Islamism was always given a victimized twist. Oh, they murdered Mahashay Rajpal because they were offended. Oh, they murdered Hindus in Kohat because they were offended. Oh, they joined Khilafat. This is Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi's words. That Hindus were just
And they
not
don't want to
in a
recognize the
position to
pattern
make the
of that
Musalmans
because
feel like
they don't
their
care.
brothers.
They
And therefore they were
prefer
hurt.
to continue
And
to make
therefore
the
they went on a
nation
Malabar
pure.
genocide of Hindu rampage. The authorities have also
It's just a
only
big
woken up
game.
when Hindus decided to defend themselves or retaliate. After Noakhali, when the Noakhali violence was happening, Nehru and Mr. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi maintained a studious silence, not a word. They only spoke up when a Bihar happened in response to a Noakhali. They went to Bihar to assuage the Muslims who were by now crying victims, saying that, oh, the barbaric Hindus are murdering us. But nobody saw that before Bihar happened, in Noakhali, thousands and thousands and thousands of Hindus were beheaded, raped, murdered. And last but not the least, the state only wakes up to Muslim street veto. 295A was passed not because Hindus were hurt when they published 2 books against Hindus. It was passed because the Muslims decided to go on a rampage and murder Mahashay Rajpal. We see parallels today, don't we? All the conclusions that we've drawn right now, whether it's the deracinated state waking up only when the Musalman decides to take to the street, whether it's Hindus being told that, hey, it's your fault that you're being murdered, you didn't make the Muslim feel like he's your brother. You didn't make sure that the Muslim was not hurt. You dared to respond. You dared to publish a book. You dared to write 2 poems after the Muslims called you kafirs, after the Muslims insulted your idols and your murtis. How dare you? You should have kept quiet and died with a smile on your face. This is again.
Yeah, because they're kafirs, right? Second-class citizens.
Now, let's keep in mind all of these conclusions that we've drawn, and let's come back to what's happening now. Since we've, in brief, covered about 100 years of Muslim outrages against Hindus.
Not allowed.
When the year 2022 started, I think all of us were just limping back to normalcy after the 2020 anti-Hindu riots. we could still remember Ankit Sharma being stabbed multiple times and his
Yeah, but in the words of
being
Ilhan Omar, that is
pulled
just
out of his
something that
body.
some people did
We could still remember
a little bit
Dilbar
time
Negi
ago.
with
Not
his
much,
hands
not
and
very
legs
long ago.
chopped off, burnt alive
Yeah.
in Anand Sweets. We remember these victims. After 2020, even when 2022 started, we were talking about them. We were documenting the cases. So what happens when 2022 starts? On the 6th of January 2022, ISIS comes out with a magazine, with their magazine edition. In the new edition, it asks Muslims to take back the illegal structure called Babri, which was built by invaders on Ram Janmabhoomi. And they, of course, call for jihad against quote unquote dirty cow piss drinkers, which is Hindus. How many liberals do you hear throwing that jive at us now, that we are dirty cow piss drinkers? Anyway, while the January edition of ISIS was released, you were transported back to 2020
Has so much
because it
hate.
was on the 27th of February 2020 when ISIS introduced their India-centric magazine. Now, 27th February 2020 is a special date because the anti-Hindu violence in Delhi was just about dwindling. I think it peaked on the 26th, and on 27th morning itself, also there were certain incidents of violence. But this was in the throes of the Delhi anti-Hindu riot that ISIS decided to come out with their India-centric magazine. It's not about religion, of course, we are told. On the cover of the magazine, they had the lawyer Mahmood Paracha, who had held a seminar in a mosque not too long ago, saying that Muslims and Dalits need to be armed for self-defense and they need to be helped so that they can acquire arms license. Now, why is this Muslim and Dalit trope important? If you remember, in the PFI 2047 document, where they wanted to turn India into an Islamic nation, they had also mentioned that the Muslims can rule if they are in minority, but they only need 50% of scheduled caste, scheduled tribe vote. And for that, they need to keep reminding them of the so-called atrocities that they had faced in the past. So this was a very carefully crafted Jai Bhim, Jai Meme sort of a trope which was being furthered. While this is being furthered, Op India almost on a daily basis is recording cases where the Muslim hordes are going on rampages against Dalits. But again, we won't get into that too much. Now, when we talk about the Delhi anti-Hindu riots, we mainly talk about what happened in February 2020. But the violence actually started in 2019. One of the first incidents of violence in 2019 that I remember is Haus Qazi. I don't know how many of you would remember that. I had gone to Haus Qazi. It's a small area in Chandni Chowk in the heart of Delhi. And we had covered this case where a very tiny temple, a Durga Mandir, was desecrated by a Muslim mob. The Muslim mob was easily over 200, 300 people, according to locals. When I went there, I saw that the murtis were broken, and the locals told me that the Muslim mob had even urinated on the murtis. When I took a tour of the mandir, I went inside the gully. It's a very narrow gully, and only Hindus live in that gully. Otherwise, they're completely surrounded by Muslims. The glass of the mandir was also broken. The locals showed me that the Delhi police had got new murtis and new glass overnight to replace the ones in the mandir so that the news would not go out that the Muslims had gone on a rampage and allegedly urinated on the murtis and desecrated the temple. I saw all of that and I came out of the gully. A husband and wife were sitting on the road. A mother was clutching a piece of paper and she was wailing uncontrollably. I asked the locals what happened and why she's crying. Her 14-year-old Hindu son was missing since the violence broke out in that area. I was standing in the middle. There was a barricade. The Hindus were chanting Jai Shri Ram and the Muslims were screaming Allahu Akbar, Narai Takbir. I spoke to the Muslims as well, by the way. They blamed a random Hindu halwai who fanned violence. I found no evidence of that. The Hindu halwai was just that. He was a halwai. And apparently the fight broke out over parking spaces. but I refuse to believe that because according to the locals,
Wow.
they were trying to
Oh, they
drive
have some
out the Hindu
imagination, don't
population
they?
from that
Wow. They
narrow
come up
lane
with all kinds of
so that
different
it could be a
things to
complete
say to
Muslim-dominated area.
justify what they
Now
do.
back to this mother. She's wailing,
Parking tickets.
screaming, crying.
Oh, this. Oh,
And I asked the
that. It's
locals
always
what happened. She
something.
said the boy was missing. And according to the parents, the Muslims had kidnapped him. There was no evidence, of course. I'm not the police. But we did have the copy of the FIR. I came back to my hotel room in Delhi. At that time, I was happily living in Calcutta. Not anymore, but anyway. I came back to my hotel room in Delhi and I started writing the report. I started writing the report after my boss, Rahul Roshan, who's sitting over there, yelled at me uncontrollably because he did not want to give me 2-3 hours to rest. So I started writing the report and it was released. Immediately after the report, we were slammed. Op India was criticized by left portals who I don't wish to name. They went on a rampage saying that how dare you report that a Hindu boy is missing in this violence? How do you know he was missing? How do you know that the Muslims took him? If you're reporting the version of the parents and if you're reporting the version of the FIR without a police investigation, you are merely fanning more tension in the area. This is a 14-year-old boy who's missing. Once the boy was found, hale and hearty, alive, I will not get into why I think or how I think he was found, but he was found. The media wrote that, look, the boy has been found alive. Op India was trying to fan tension.
Oh.
So we should have reported that a Hindu boy was missing, a child, only if he turns up dead. If there is a dead body, the media can report that, okay, a Hindu boy is dead, he's been killed. But if he is missing and you report the boy missing, then you're fanning tension. Because who the hell cares? It's a Hindu boy. If he's missing, he'll come back. Nobody cares about a Hindu life anyway. After horse Qazi settled down a little bit, the Hindus decided that they were going to hold a Hanuman Chalisa chanting at the mandir. While that was happening, a lot of media houses covered that these amazing Muslim men from the area, who a little while ago were going on a rampage against the Hindus, were so benevolent that they were actually helping serving food to the Hindus of the area who were going to do a Hanuman Chalisa recital. They are so plural and so tolerant. Hindus are just blaming them for no good reason. The Hindus, of course, denied it. They said that the Muslims came for a photo op, they clicked pictures and they went away. They have not done anything for the Hindus. In every riot, by the way, you see this theme. There were Muslims protecting the temple. They made a chain to protect the temple so that no harm came to it. Nobody tells you that the Muslims were protecting the temple from the Muslims itself. It was not the Hindus pelting stone at their own temple. So it's a sleight of hand by the media to ensure that so innocent and so peace-loving and so plural
it's a big
Muslims
game.
Don't get a bad name, but we
big
know
acting. Golden Globe Award goes to them.
After the horse Qazi incident, there was a spate of violence in 2019. By October, there were a spate of incidents of stone pelting and violence against Durga Puja and Dasera processions, if you remember, in 2019. In Balrampur, a Durga Puja procession was attacked amidst chants of Pakistan Zindabad. Remember we spoke about Ummah. So that this is why the Muslims in India will chant Pakistan Zindabad, because their loyalty lies to the land of the pure. Dar-ul-Islam, not Darul-Harb. In Gorakhpur, meat pieces were thrown strategically on the path of the Durga Puja procession. It was done purely to humiliate and mock Hindus, no other purpose. In Badaun, temple idols were vandalized and desecrated. In Arunachal Pradesh and Assam too, murtis were desecrated and they came under siege because stones were being pelted by the Muslim mob. There were several such incidents. I've just told you 3 or 4.
These facts are extremely horrifying. I want to give a special thanks to this team that worked very hard to bring all of these facts together for us. This is priceless material and helps us to become more aware. I also want to share a personal experience I had in Paharganj in Delhi just a few months back. I went to a store without any tilak on, just as a normal Westerner, and I bought some snacks. Another day I went in with tilak and rudraksha on, as I had just been to temple. That day at the same store, I asked if they had Patanjali products available. The store manager said no, and he pushed me out of the store by saying, "We are closing, so please leave." The same store manager who was so nice to me before and allowed me to stay as long as I wanted previously was pushing me out just a day later. I found out soon after he was a Muslim and got triggered because of my looks. So for me, I cannot support this and such products that have a clear discrimination against the rest of humanity. This is intolerance that I never expected to see. So is it fair to say that they can always play the victim card? This is my own personal experience, and these experiences should be validated, as all Hindus in the past should be validated for what they went through. It is really inexcusable. So we all have to unite against this continuous and heinous Hindu genocide, discrimination, and Hindu phobia. Okay guys, well, I'll see you in the next video. Ram Ram.